Hello everyone, and thank you for joining us today for the Ministry of Agriculture's Invasive Species webinar series. Today is our last of the three, and it'll be on Common Tansy. My name is Margaret Parsons, and I'm an agri-environmental specialist with the Ministry of Agriculture based out of Humboldt, and I'll be chairing the webinar today. The speakers from the ministry are Paige Straff, an agri-environmental specialist, and Andre Bonneau, a range management extension specialist. Firstly, I'd like to start with a land acknowledgement. The Ministry of Agriculture respects and has the honor of working on lands within Saskatchewan. I wish to acknowledge Saskatchewan is the traditional and ancestral lands of the Anishinaabe, Blackfoot, Cree, Dene, Dakota, Lakota, Nakota, Ojibwe, Saulteaux, and Sioux, and home of the Métis people. We respect and honor the treaties that were made on all territories. We acknowledge the harms and mistakes of the past, and we are committed to moving forward in partnership with Indigenous nations. Before we begin, I have a few housekeeping notes. The presentation is scheduled to take around 40 minutes, leaving time for questions or comments at the end. If you have questions during the presentation, you may type them in the question box in the right-hand side of the control panel, and we'll be sure to answer them at the end of the presentation. Because during the presentation you'll be muted, so there's no interference with the audio. If you have difficulty listening with your speakers, there's also a telephone option which requires you to dial in to listen through a phone. After you exit the webinar today, a brief evaluation will appear, so please take the time to fill it out since it helps us plan events in the future. A link to the recorded webinar will be sent out to registered participants following, and it'll also be posted to our website as well. And then CEUs are also being offered for any CCAs on this webinar. So in order to get the credit, you have to attend the entire live event, and we'll put a QR code at the end of the presentation to collect that credit. If you do miss the code and you attended live, you can email us afterwards and we can work with you to get your credit. So at this time, we can start the webinar, and I'll hand it off to Paige.
Thanks, Margaret, for the introduction. Can you guys hear me okay? Okay. Perfect. So I will be going over the non-herbicide portion of the webinar, and then I'll pass it over to Andre, and he'll talk about some herbicide options. So to start off with, what exactly is Common Tansy? The Latin name for it is Tanacetum vulgare. It's a noxious weed in Saskatchewan, and it was introduced from Europe as an ornamental plant. It used to be used for a lot of different purposes like medicinal, decorative, preservative, and it escaped from a lot of people's gardens, which is kind of how it became to be a noxious weed. It grows well in a lot of open spaces and well-drained sites. It also thrives in disturbed areas, so you'll see it a lot in ditches, pastures, along fence lines, in abandoned farmyards, kind of lots of places that have different perennial stands there. It is a perennial species, and it has known toxicity to animals and livestock. Livestock poisoning is fairly uncommon, but if they do eat it in large quantities, it has been known to cause abortions in cattle. So its identification, it's kind of a unique plant that the flowers, I usually don't see it on any other types of species, or not any, but not many. So it has a flat top with several different flowers on it. It is usually described as button-like heads, and it usually flowers from July to September. The leaves, as you can see in this photo, are kind of fern-like, and they're pinnately divided leaves, which means that it's a bunch of leaflets on one leaf, and they all have those jagged edges on it. This plant, it can get about 6 feet tall, but I usually see it around 2 to 4 feet. And when it's mature, usually the stems are red-purple color, like you can see in this photo. I also wanted to show a photo of Common Tansy in the winter. Usually when I'm explaining to people what Common Tansy is, they aren't familiar with the name. And then I explain to them, have you ever seen those brown sticks with the seeds in the winter that are popping out of the snow? And it immediately rings a bell. It's very common in Northeast Saskatchewan. So yeah, once you see it, you can't really unsee it. So its growth habit and reproduction. So it reproduces mostly from seeds and to a limited extent through rhizomes that slowly expand their reach. It tolerates a wide range of moisture and temperature zones, which means that it can, encroach into a lot of different areas. The roots are fairly shallow but dense. They're fairly concentrated to the top 2 feet of the soil, so they're very competitive for water and different nutrients with other species, which makes it fairly invasive. And it is generally an invader in overgrazed pastures. You don't see it very often in annual croplands, just because it's getting tilled up so often. Okay, so I wanted to chat about some similar species that people might mistake common tansy for. So there's a lot of different species around that have those yellow flowers that from a distance can be quite alarming to people. So goldenrod is one that some people will mistake for it. Goldenrod is a native species, so it's not a bad thing to have in your fields. It's kind of expected to be there. It has fairly different leaves than common tansy, so once you get up close to it, you would be able to tell that it is quite different, and it has some aster-like flowers on it. Leafy spurge is also another plant that has some yellow or lime green flowers on it. It has some heart-shaped bracts for the flower heads, and the leaves again are quite different. They're long and narrow. It's hard to see in this photo, but yeah, quite different. If you're ever not sure if something is leafy spurge or not, if you pick up the plant and break the stem open, it will have a milky sap in it. And another species that I wanted to mention that's a noxious species is yellow toadflax. It also has those yellow flowers, but they're more like snapdragon looking flowers and has very narrow leaves on it. So if you ever do see a patch of yellow flowers in the field, be sure to check it out and make sure it's not a weed, and you can always get a second opinion on it as well. So I wanted to show a comparison of goldenrod versus common tansy. As you can see in this photo, they're very similar heights, so it could be alarming from a distance. But again, the goldenrod has those wider, long leaves, and the common tansy has a bunch of little leaflets that are jagged. And side by side, you can see that the flowers are quite different, and you see those button-like heads on it. Okay, so I wanted to discuss a bit of integrated weed management. So if you've attended the last 2 webinars on absinthe and leafy spurge, you'll already have heard about this a little bit, but I wanted to cover it again today just in case new people were sitting on these webinars. So integrated weed management can be explained as a multi-approach way to control weeds. Usually things that are involved are prevention, physical or mechanical control, cultural control. So cultural is anything that changes the environment that species is in. Biological usually includes insects, and chemical, I'm sure everyone on this call is familiar with that one. I guess one thing I wanted to touch on is that it's important to have a tool approach, because if let's say if you're spraying every year, it's possible to get maybe some herbicide resistance, or maybe mowing all the time might not be the most effective method alone, but in combination it can be fairly helpful. So the first portion, and maybe the most important, is prevention. So if you're able to make sure that those plants don't get established in the first place, or if you're able to get them when there's just a few in the field, that will really help. And a lot of prevention is just following different biosecurity protocols. So if possible, you can clean your equipment between sites. And if you're not able to do that, if you know a field is weedy, maybe you would go to that field last instead of going to it first and dragging it along to each field. Because we all know that life gets busy and you don't always have time to clean between each site. Another option is to minimize your disturbance and maintain plant cover. So a method of doing that maybe would be, if you're going to that field often with different trucks or quads or equipment, trying not to rut up those fields. Let's say if there's wet conditions, just things like that. Also, maintaining forage stands is a really important way of preventing weeds from encroaching in. So if you're overgrazing a pasture, that leaves open spaces for those weeds to be able to move in. And we generally recommend that you only graze about 50 to 60% of your desirable grasses, and that's kind of that take half, leave half method of rangeland management. But it's a good way to not have the species encroach in or have opportunity to encroach in. And the last portion of prevention would be monitoring your sites. So just going to your fields at different parts of the year. If you go out in the spring, you might not be able to see some flowering plants, or it might not be as obvious. If you're able to go out there and check if there is plants existing, how many are there? Is it spreading? You can take photos, you can get GPS points. Maybe you can try to control it while you're out there if it's a small population. But this will be really important for future years, because I know thinking back to different fields, it's really hard to remember what something looked like last summer and if it's a lot different than this current summer kind of thing. So another option to control common tansy is physical or mechanical options. So there were a few questions come in about controlling common tansy in environmentally sensitive areas. So I wanted to mention hand pulling or mowing. Hand pulling is a good option if there's not many plants there. But if you plan to do that, it'll be good to wear gloves and any protective clothing to make sure you don't get toxins on your skin. And also make sure that you're digging out the rhizome to make sure that your efforts are going to be, I guess, noticeable. You can also mow in environmentally sensitive areas, and I'll get a bit into that in the next bullet here, but those are both good options if you're not able to spray in those areas. So it's important to know that mowing alone can prevent seed production and deplete energy in stored roots, but it won't kill the existing plants that are there. So mowing is not just a one-time thing either. You'll have to mow multiple times to have success. And I think the main thing is just mowing before it's flowering or the plant goes to seed, because then once it hits the ground, that is one of the main methods that the plant is able to move into new sites. And if you are mowing, just make sure you can set your mower blade high so that you're just getting the tops of those flowers and not hopefully getting rid of your desirable plants so they can be competitive in the stand. And with mowing, you can get a flush of common tansy show up afterwards. So I guess it's a way of trying to be competitive in that area. So you'll get a lot of new regrowth, and it might be ideal to use a combination of mowing and then maybe fall spraying. And Andre can touch on that later. And I also wanted to chat about cultivation. This might not be an ideal option for common tansy because it can spread by its rhizomes as well. So if you're just cultivating once or twice, it could spread those roots around, and then you could end up having a worse problem. But in the same breath, annual crops that are tilled fairly often, you don't see common tansy there very often. So it's an option, but maybe not ideal. Also, where common tansy is common, it's usually in established stands that you don't want to break up unless the problem is bad enough that you have to. So cultural control, from the resources that I've read, prescribed fire may not be effective for this plant, mostly because it's going to top kill the plant, but the plant can still resprout from any root buds that weren't affected by the heat. So it's maybe not great, but the fire could be used to reduce any litter there and get rid of any dead stems that would kind of clear the area if you're wanting to spray it later on and actually hit the leaf surface area. So it's kind of mixed emotions on this, because if you do open up the stand, you could be opening it up for those weeds to move back in. Also, a second option for cultural control that I wanted to chat about was getting some competitive species established. So that could be maybe some desirable forage species. I know some people, when they're trying to get rid of their weeds, they'll put a field to annual cropland for a couple of years to get control of it, or control of the weeds, and then they'll put it into a desirable forage stand. So that's always an option to consider as well. So I also wanted to chat about targeted grazing. So targeted grazing is a biological tool that turns target weeds into forage. So with this strategy, you're going to have to predetermine your grazing season, your duration, and your intensity to have success. And proper plant staging will be really important for this, because if you put your goats or sheep out there when the plants are a bit tough, it might not be as successful because they might not be grazing on it as much, and they might be going to other grasses that are out there. So if you're able to do targeted grazing when they're in the vegetative or bolting stage versus when it is kind of browning off a bit, you might have a bit more success. I also wanted to mention that sheep and goats are both options that you can use for targeted grazing on Common Tansy, but goats have been more commonly reported so far. And from the resources that I've read, Common Tansy is kind of not high on the preference list for the goats, but they will eat it, and they will kind of get trained to eat it a bit. And as you can see in this photo, they will use the rip and strip method. So what that means is they'll bite the bottom of the plant, and then with one sweeping head motion, they'll get all of the leaves ripped off if it's in that vegetative state. And another thing that's important to consider after you're done grazing a site is to put those animals in a holding facility for 1 to 2 weeks before putting them onto new land. There isn't, I guess, enough research yet to know how long or how well those seeds survive in the digestive tract. So different resources say, you know, putting them in a holding facility for 6 days is enough, and some said 2 weeks. So I guess that might need a little bit more research to decide on how long. And then also another important factor is to consider potential toxicity from thujone. So that's an essential oil that causes convulsions and abortions in livestock. Sheep and goats can eat a significant amount of Common Tansy without having toxic effects, but I did read a study from Montana State saying that it might be ideal to remove them about 4 weeks before your breeding timeline, just to make sure that you won't have issues. I'm not a livestock specialist, so I can't really comment on things, but if anyone has questions about that afterwards, I can direct you to the right person for that. I also wanted to chat about some ADOPT project results. There was a project completed from 2014 to 2016 by Bart Lardner with the Western Beef Development Center, and Nadia Mori. She used to be a forage specialist with the Ministry of Agriculture. This project was about goat browsing on Common Tansy in a pasture in northeast Saskatchewan. It was really interesting to read through, so we do have our handout with different references. If anyone is interested in looking it up after, there is a link to the ADOPT website to look it up. In short, this project was 2 years long, and in the first year, they put the goats out there for, I believe, about 10 days, and they saw a great reduction in the amount of Common Tansy that was out there, and they were very impressed with the results. But they did note that there was a flush of that Common Tansy come back later in the fall. And in the second year, or sorry, I should back it up to the first year again, they grazed closer to the beginning of July. I think it might have been July 5th to 18th or somewhere around there. So the plants were more in that vegetative state. And in the second year, they grazed somewhere between 8 to 10 days as well. And it was in later July. They noted that this was a little bit later than, you know, what might have been ideal, because the plants were getting a little bit tough, and they noticed that the goats were going for more so the upper leaves and the flowers. So they had a little bit more hesitation when it came to grazing on those sites in the second year. And they did note that they had even more growth of Common Tansy. So they pointed out that they had some resource constraints to keep going with the project, but they would recommend having some follow-up measures afterwards. So whether that would be fall grazing to get rid of, some of the plants that are coming back up, because it should be a lower population, or considering fall spraying, they thought it would be really ideal because you would have a lot of new leaves and maybe the herbicide would be more effective that way. They did recommend, if possible, grazing for a minimum of 4 years, at least twice a year. So that is good to know that it's not just a 1 year and done kind of deal. And they did chat about the timing of grazing really mattering. Sorry, the timing of grazing really mattered. So like I mentioned before, when it was in the vegetative or bolting state versus when it was a little bit tougher, they could see that when they were monitoring the site. Okay, so some of the biological control options that are out there, I guess right now there are none for Common Tansy, and they're still being studied currently. So a paper by Dr. Alec McClay and a few other authors discussed that they were looking into a type of root feeding flea beetle, a leaf feeding tortoise beetle, a stem feeding moth, and a stem feeding weevil. They did note that the root feeding flea beetle and the stem feeding weevil seem to be the most host specific and promising so far, but they're continuing to study it, and it might still be some time before we see this, being uptake, or before there's uptake here, before it's approved. Okay, and that is my portion for the non-herbicide control options, but I will pass it over to Andre to talk about some herbicide options.
Excuse me. Hello, everyone. I thought what I'd do this time here for my turn is to kind of go through the herbicides as listed in front of you, but also talk a little bit about some of the things to think about when you're selecting a herbicide and your application methods and how it ties into some of the other options that Paige talked about earlier in the presentation here. This list in front of you here is straight out of the Guide to Crop Protection. There's a section in the guide, I think it's on page 88 of the 2024 version of it. And to be honest, this is about as good a list as you're going to get. You're going to find different herbicides. You're going to get neighbors and friends talking about different things that they've tried. Right off the top, I'll say, unless it's on the label, don't bother. Because if something doesn't go well, it's going to be your problem and nobody else's. So stick to the label. Glyphosate and Escort. Glyphosate, of course, is a non-selective, so it's going to kill pretty much everything it touches. And it's really good. It'll kill tansy 99 times out of 100 without a problem. The problem with glyphosate the problem with glyphosate, of course, is that you can't really use it for blanket spraying, especially if you're working on native prairie. Like I said, you're going to kill pretty much everything out there that's actively growing. It only works for spot spraying. I wouldn't use anything else. I wouldn't use glyphosate for anything except spot spraying, unless you want to take the whole stand right out. Escort, which is imethylsulfuron methyl, is, from what I've read, is one of the best herbicides you can get for tansy. It'll work really well on it. The issue with Escort, of course, is that it's not a residual herbicide. It'll kill the plant, and it'll set it back, or just like it's supposed to. But you've done nothing with the seed bank that's sitting underneath it. By seed bank, I mean that especially if a plant has been sitting there for 2, 3, 4, 5 years, you've got about 3, 4, 5 years of seed sitting on the ground around it and drifted off in all directions. So it sets it back, it holds it back, but it doesn't completely eliminate the problem. The following ones, Navius, Reclaim, Restore, Milestone, True Range, Clearview, Sightline, they are all residual herbicides. And when you apply them, as to the rate, you will get fairly good control for 2 to 3 years, depending on what you're trying to control and your application rates and your methodology. Aminocyclopyrachlor and methylsulfuron, Navius and True Range, seems to be the ones that they're the newer ones. They came out just recently. I think it used to be called MAP 28 at one time or another. And we've been playing with this stuff for a long time. very good stuff. If you follow the label directions, and I'll repeat this over and over again, if you follow the label directions and you stage the plant correctly, it will do a great job. Reclaim Clearview, a little bit older chemistry, but there again, maybe not quite as long control or suppression, but it'll do exactly what you want it to do. Clearview and Sightline, they're in the book, but I'm not sure that they're available to farmers and ranchers. I think you have to have an application certificate to buy and apply this stuff. I may be wrong, but yeah, maybe check on that before you commit yourself to it. Milestone, I'm quite sure is an industrial herbicide. I used to use Milestone back in Alberta. Very expensive stuff, but very effective. It's very good stuff. I think I'll get you to advance the slide page. Yeah, very good. Plant stages and conditions. We all know this. Herbicides seem to be very effective on plants that are actively growing. Okay, now I've got that little arrow there to remind me to look at the plant over on the right side. Is that plant actively growing? Right, it's gone to flower, and the plant is all green and everything, but how much activity is going on in that plant? I like to think back to an old saying I've heard, and I don't know how old it is, but a plant is a seed's way of making more seeds. So once the plant is done making more seeds, it's pretty much irrelevant. You don't need it anymore. So if you were to go into this stand with plants looking like they're right in front of you on the right side here, is that plant actively growing? Right? And if you do kill that plant, and you probably will kill that plant, but have you stopped seed set? And that's a question I have, and for all the herbicides. I know in cereals, you apply herbicides or you apply glyphosate on cereals, you can get a problem with reverse geotropism. But I don't know about tansy or any of the noxious weeds out there. But it's something to think about. You know, if you go out there and spray this and it dies, did you actually accomplish anything? And now those seeds are going to fall on the ground, and now you're going to have another flush of seeds over and above the last previous years that's already sitting there. So something to think about. Healthy plants are more susceptible. Any plants under stress, whether it's heat or frost or cold weather or, well, flooding is kind of silly, but you know, any time that plant is under stress, it's probably not, the herbicide is not going to be as effective as it would be if it was actively growing. If you look at the label on Escort and I think on glyphosate, but Escort and glyphosate, they'll say that it should be before, at bolting or before when you apply that. And I think it has a lot to do with that reason that if you spray it when it's gone to flower, you're probably, you know, you're probably not going to be as effective on the seed itself or rather than the plant. I've also noticed on a lot of the labels that the residual herbicides don't seem to be plant stage dependent. And if you think about it, that makes perfect sense, right? If it's a soil active or a soil residual herbicide, it'll stay there for a couple of years and it'll suppress or stop pretty much anything else that comes up after that application. So really, you know, whether it's a plant like we've got in front of us here or whether it's 6-8 inches tall, it doesn't seem to matter as much with the residuals as it would with the non-selective or something like the Escort. And the seed bank, right? The residual herbicides, like I mentioned just a few seconds ago, that the residual herbicides can do a pretty good job on the seed bank. So anything that germinates after the original plant has been killed off or suppressed, you're hoping that the residual activity of that herbicide will suppress that and slow it down a little bit more. I'll get you to forward again, Paige. Paige talked about this a little bit, and I'm just going to repeat it a little bit. Current and previous research, treating various herbicides with nitrogen fertilizer. And there's an undergrad student, I'm probably going to butcher the name, so if she's online, I'm sorry. Obaida El-Shami, a student of Dr. John Bennett's, as part of her classes, she put together a bit of a project looking at the application of herbicides with nitrogen fertilizer. And this has a lot to do with trying to influence the effect of the arbuscular mycorrhizal fungi. I'm not going to pretend I know exactly what's going on there, but it does look like it has a lot of potential. I know that they've been working on other weeds. Dr. Bennett has been working on other weeds and this whole concept, and we're kind of watching very carefully, because if we can get more effectiveness of these herbicides by using a nitrogen fertilizer, I don't see anything wrong. The nice thing about that is that if you can knock back that plant with your herbicide and at the same time applying nitrogen to kind of boost all of the other forage grasses and yeah, basically the forage grasses around it, it can go a long way to keep more of those seeds from coming up or from germinating. And Paige mentioned earlier that Dr. Alec McClay did some work. I think he was working a little bit with Meewasin Valley Authority, and there was a few projects out there that he had been playing with. We need more time on that one. And if you think about it, you're looking for a specific insect or a specific insect that will kill that plant or suppress that plant and nothing else, especially native plants. If it goes after the tansy, but it also jumps onto another plant in that same family, it's probably not going to get approved, because there's a risk of basically, instead of introducing another weed, now you've introduced an insect that may be detrimental to native species out there. If we forward to the next slide page, we'll talk a little bit about wicking. There's a few examples of wicks. The top left-hand corner in the photo on the right is a project I was working on in Alberta with a guy named Mark Naughton, sorry, in the Stettler area. Just a homemade piece of equipment here. It's basically just a drum with a carpet rolled around it, held together with zip ties. It was thrown together pretty quickly. And of course, some nozzles spraying, in this case, glyphosate, onto the roller, and the roller is rolling over the crop. As far as I'm aware, glyphosate is the only product that is registered to be used in this way. So I would be interested to see what would happen with other herbicides, but that's going to be somebody else to try that. I'll leave it alone for now. The one issue that we had with this one specifically, and in this case here, we're rolling on to some snowberry, western snowberry. If your roller is too far down, you get too much of a snap action coming out of that roller. And especially if you look on the back of that applicator, you've got a bar sitting there, and that's going to be agitating those little shrubs that much more. And then we ended up with a whole bunch of glyphosate spraying out in all directions. And as pretty as this machine is, it pretty much killed everything in that stand. So it's something to think about. If you got too much material there, too many plants there, you got too much waving action, that glyphosate is going to go almost anywhere it wants to go. So you got to be really careful about that. The other one then on the bottom left-hand corner, it's the same thing. This one uses a cotton line instead of a roller. Same idea. If I were to make one suggestion with the red quad with the applicator on the front, I would probably like to see that applicator shifted off to the side, mainly because I don't want to be running over applied plants. Maybe knock off some of that glyphosate. And at the same time, it's a lot easier to figure out where you've been and how to approach your next pass if you know where you've been before. And that's part of the problems that we run into when we're spraying out in the field like this. Unless you know where you've been, you can end up with some pretty big misses out there. The next one. Okay, this is just an example of another wick applicator, but this one is more for trees. This is a photo I picked off the internet. I did see some photos of front end loader mounted wick applicators, but this would work just as well, same idea. And it might even be a little bit better in heavier stands. It's hard to say, but just to show that they're actually quite easy to put together. And a few other things too that I want everyone to think about is when it comes to noxious weeds in general, we're talking about tansy here, but in general, noxious weeds, Paige mentioned it earlier, get on it quick. Monitor your fields, monitor your fields, monitor your fields. The bigger the patch gets, the more expensive it's going to be. right? If you can hit it right away, if you see those plants and they're less than 2 years old, backpack a little bit of glyphosate, read the label, mix it correctly, get out there and get on it right away. Because as soon as those plants get out there and flower, you've probably got a seed bank to deal with there. So the sooner you get out there to treat those plants, the better. If those stands or if those little patches have been sitting there for a few years, now I would probably not recommend glyphosate because, well, you could do it, but you're probably applying glyphosate every year or 2 years for, could be up to 20 years. I think Paige and I talked about the life of the seed, and I think she mentioned 20 years. So you're doing this, you're keeping that plant from going to seed for about 20 years, and you're getting rid of the seed that's sitting underneath that plant as well, right? So it could take a while. So in a case like that, where pasture has been there a little bit longer, I would probably go with a residual, just because it gives you a little bit more time to manage that seed bank. Another one to it, and I've dealt with a lot of people. I've been doing this for quite a few years now, and a lot of times when I get calls about a herbicide that didn't work, it's either because of water, they didn't put enough water on it, or they didn't follow the label to the T. These herbicides are expensive. And if we start playing with these rates, oh, we'll get away with half, or we can cut back on the water. They've been doing this for a while. They put the label together. They spent a lot of money to put these labels on these bottles, these jugs. They know what they're doing, right? Do it right, do it once, and you're done, right? And of course, you reapply every 2 or 3 years, but do it right every time you can. It'll cut back on your costs, because if you do it wrong and you have to do it again, now you just doubled your costs. Don't argue, just do it and pay what it costs. Like I said earlier, the longer you wait to manage that stand or to get on top of those weeds, the more expensive it's going to be. And it's not going to get any cheaper. So get on top of it and pay what it costs. Find the product that you need, find the product that you want to use, and just get on it. There's programs out there. I think Paige will talk about that a little bit later. There's programs out there to help us get on top of these weeds. Take advantage of those programs, pay the money, just get it done. Mowing and grazing, she mentioned the goats and the mowing there. Mowing and grazing is really good, especially mowing is very good for managing your stages. Like I said earlier, you don't want this stuff to go to seed. So if you can get out there and mow it, just to give you a little bit more time to get on top of it, come back in a couple of weeks to see where it's at. And if it's at the right stage, then give it a shot of, true range or reclaim. Basically, you're resetting your clock, keeping it from going to seed, and it gives you another chance to get on top of it. And think about the seed bank. Do not let this stuff go to seed, because every time it goes to seed, you're set back another year. If you're going to manage this weed, you have to stay on top of the seed bank. You have to stay on top of the flowering. And something too, like we've got the herbicide applicators, so there's the wick applicators, and we talked a little bit about backpacks and everything else. With Tansy, she had some pictures there from the Northeast. I think that was Pathland pasture. There's some of those areas where, yeah, you could blanket spray that whole thing and do a fairly good job of it. But you have to start thinking about, if you have a tame stand, not a native stand, but if you have a tame stand and you have so much Tansy in there that you feel that you should get a high clearance in there and clearing it all out, think about what it's going to look like when you're done. Okay. If you go in there and you take out all of those plants out there, now you've opened up the canopy. And unless you've used a residual herbicide, it's probably just, like I said, you're opening up the canopy and you're going to get another flush. And then if you really have to stay on top of that and think about what it's going to look like after you're done. If you don't have enough of a stand there after you spray this stuff, that to maintain a good forage stand, sometimes it's best, if you can, and on tame, not on native, but if you can, it may be a better idea just to tear it up and start over, right? The costs are going to be there, the costs are going to be high. You're going to be fighting with this stuff for a while. So if the opportunity is there and the dollars make sense, tear it up and start over. Don't fight with it. The cultivator will win every time, right? So clean it up, put in an annual crop if you have to for 2 or 3 years. Roundup canola, Roundup Ready canola is great for this kind of stuff because you're applying Roundup every couple times a year. You're going to take out a lot of that stuff just by putting in the canola for 1 year, and then maybe a cereal for another year, and then away you go back into it. And like I said, you opened up the canopy. You open up the canopy, now you've changed the growing conditions and you made it a lot better for the tansy to get started again. I think if you advance the slide, that might be my last one here. Yeah, the rest is up to you, Paige.
Thank you, Andre. I'll make sure to keep sharing my screen this time. Okay, so I just wanted to point out that we have a few tools and resources that we've linked in the webinar. One of them is for IMAP invasives, so that's just a way to document any invasive weeds that you might be seeing. There's also resources for the Saskatchewan Invasive Species Council, the Forage U-Pick tool. That's a great tool if you're wanting to seed a stand and you need a place to start. It's great to take a look through and learn a lot about different species. And then also the Saskatchewan Invasive Plant Species Guides. Those are great. I believe that's just a little booklet, super handy to have with you, but there are more links in that handout, so make sure to check that out. Sorry, I'm just trying to change slides. Okay, so I wanted to talk about programs. There are a lot of great programs out there. One of them is the Invasive Plant Control Program. The Saskatchewan Association of Rural Municipalities, SARM, runs this one, and it is for certain herbicide costs, and I think that's what that one covers, but you'll have to talk to SARM to see what that one is all about. There is also the Targeted Grazing Beneficial Management Practice. This falls under the Resilient Agricultural Landscapes Program. So this is the program I deal with the most. I'm in the PA region, so if you're in this area, I may be your contact, but if not, I'll have a 1-800 number at the end of this, and we can send you to the correct person. That program covers different costs associated with targeted grazing, and we have a list of all of the eligible costs online. And then lastly, I also wanted to point out the Crown Land Pasture Association Invasive Weed Program. So this program is for different, I guess, pasture associations on Crown land. If you're interested in this one, your land management specialist for your area will know the most about it. But feel free to scan this QR code and it'll bring you to the Ministry of Agriculture website and it'll show you all the different programs that we have. So in summary, prevention is key. Like Andre and I talked about, this is going to be your best method to, I guess, like control things while it's still affordable to do. If you're able to plan ahead and monitor, this will be a huge step. Being able to plan ahead, knowing how you're going to control it if you see it there, and then being able to monitor for future years, like I already talked about, making sure that the plant isn't getting out of control. That's really important. And you'll need to follow an integrated weed control method for best results. So like Andre and I talked about, yeah, there's no just, I guess, one thing that will do it best. It's good to, combine maybe mowing and spraying or, grazing and spraying. So something to consider for the future. And it's important to remember that there's no one size fits all. What works for your neighbor might not work for you. And what works for you in one field might not work the same in another field, because if you have common tansy in upland pasture versus common tansy by a creek, the control options are going to be a lot different. And I just wanted to thank everyone for jumping on the webinar today. If you're interested in watching the webinars for the absinthe or leafy spurge webinars, they will be posted onto our YouTube website, or sorry, onto our YouTube. And if you want to check out the Ministry of Agriculture events calendar, there's a lot of great webinars or even in-person events coming up. So make sure to check that out. And now Andre and I can take a few questions.
Great, thanks for presenting, both of you. We do have a couple questions here. So one would be, do either of you have any knowledge on controlling tansy with table salt? This person says a farmer near a natural area they manage say that they treat tansy stands in their field by hand pulling and then sprinkling a handful of salt on the site, and it's very successful. but they haven't found any information about that. So either of you heard about that before?
I'm not familiar with it. Andre, have you?
Well, salt is toxic, so it stands to reason, but I don't have any idea how much salt or how long. I don't know. It does make sense, but the details are pretty thin in my mind.
That's fair. And then this might be a question for you, Andre. There's been a lot of talk around UAVs or drones for spot spraying. So what are the regulations of UAV spraying, and is there a pesticide applicator's license needed for this practice? Or if the producer or a custom contractor is applying an industrial product, like one of the ones that you mentioned, would they need an industrial pesticide applicator's license?
Yeah, we'll start with the AUVs, right? As far as I know, and I was over in a show in Lloyd Ministry here just a couple of weeks ago, and at that time there was no herbicide labeled to be applied with an AUV. And you know, I've been thinking about this for a long time because yeah, you're right. It would be great to be able to just load up a drone and send it out and spray your patches. But you got to remember, you got to find those patches anyway, right? And if you're out there looking for those patches, carry a backpack with you and you're done, right? Instead of spending $10,000–$15,000 on a UAV, get a $20 backpack from Princess Auto and you're done, right? So I'm not being, you know, I don't want to be a smart aleck about this, but I haven't quite figured out what the advantage would be with an AUV, because like I said, you have to find those patches anyway. So that's kind of where I stand on that one. And the other part was about herbicide application, whether
Yeah.
you need it.
Whether if you need a industrial pesticide applicator's license for an industrial product.
Oh yeah. If as far as I know, I did most of my stuff in Alberta, but in Alberta you couldn't buy an industrial product without an applicator certificate. In Saskatchewan, I would think it'd be the same. I haven't tried, but I would imagine it'd be the same. The thing is, call your retailer if you want to pick up something that you're not sure is available to you. The retailer will tell you. It's, and as that list I had a few minutes ago, you've got options, right? Aminocyclopyrachlor, you know, there used to be the TruVist. I'm not sure if it's still available or now, but you know, you've got the industrial and you've got the agricultural options there. And if you do want Sightline, but you can't, and maybe the option would be to go through Claim 2, right? There's going to be an equivalent out there if it's a good product.
Great, thanks. This might be a question for you, Paige. Tansy always seems to be the worst along fence lines. Is it birds that are spreading the seeds there, or why would it be along the fence lines?
That's a great question. It can be like the seeds can be spread by birds, equipment. I don't know if the wind could pick it up, but I do know that in the winter, like when I was showing you guys that photo, when it dries up, the seeds can just blow in the wind. So not sure if they would get caught there or what the exact reasoning would be. But yeah, it's tough to say. Definitely could be the birds.
Great. And is there a projected timeline for when some of the biocontrols might become available to the general public? Was there anything you saw on that?
The papers that Paige and I both saw, they're from 2010. I haven't seen anything newer than 2010. So if they're still working on it, they've been at it for 15 years. I would expect there is other work going on out there, but we're not aware of it. So I think right now we're in limbo until they come up with something that they're comfortable with. Paige, you got anything to add about that?
No, I haven't seen any dates. Yeah, just kind of that they're hoping to get something soon, but I'm not sure when that soon would be.
Great. Perfect. Well, that's all the questions I have here. If anyone else has any questions, their contact information is there. And we could probably put up that CEU credit